Welcome back, everybody, to episode number 12 of the Untangling Election 2021 podcast, your semi-weekly podcast covering the 2021 federal election campaign here in Canada. Today, we're going to be talking about foreign policy, one of my prime passions in life. Foreign policy is often one of the most exciting and glamorous parts of politics, in my humble opinion, and has occasionally been the focal point of electoral campaigns. But this is not the case in this election. Notably, foreign policy has been all but absent from the race. Why is this? What few issues have been talked about? What do we think should have been more prominent issues? Well, we're going to explore that today in this podcast. Joining me is a few other foreign policy-minded friends of mine, some new voices, some old. Kris, tell them who you are.
Hey guys, I'm Kris, and I'm doing a master's at the University of Waterloo, and I specialize in international relations.
Yeah, great to have you, Kris. Kris and I go way back to Waterloo days, so it's nice to have some more friends on, right?
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, speaking of people who aren't friends, Ryan.
Yeah, no, not friend. I'm Ryan, been on before, but just to go over briefly, I'm also doing a master's at Carleton, and it is in international affairs with a specialization in intelligence.
So you must be a very smart man, right?
No.
My master's somewhat leaned towards the intelligence studies somewhat, but talking about myself, I'm Simon. I also studied at the University of Waterloo for my bachelor's, but then I did a master's in international relations at Leiden Universiteit in the Netherlands, where I specialized in global conflict in the modern era, which is the sexiest title for a program. However, it is about conflict, so maybe not that sexy. Regardless, should we also really quickly, before we get into the issues at hand, should we talk about our personal biases a bit and tell people who we are and where we stand? Ryan, tell us about yourself.
Yeah, so I'm certainly left-leaning. I'm kind of a toss-up between NDP and Liberal in terms of how I want to vote this election. I still haven't quite made up my mind. But yeah, and then in terms of foreign policy view, I mean, it's hard to say left or right view, but in general, I'm very supportive of a cooperative foreign policy. I don't think Canada should necessarily be outwardly antagonistic to anyone, but that's a whole other complex topic, so I won't get into that.
Yeah, very true. I myself personally, I'm very neutral. I can't vote in this election. I'm working on my Canadian citizenship application, but I do value myself as being very neutral between all the parties. I would not know who to vote for in this election. None of them really appeal to me in that sense. And foreign policy leaning, I do think very realist, I've realized, but that's also because I did my international relations degree in a very left-leaning institution in Europe. So that might have had some influence on that. So I'm pretty receptive to all strains of ideas. And finally, Kris, tell us about your political biases, just so people know who you are.
Yeah, so like Ryan, I tend to kind of shift between NDP and Liberal, definitely very left-leaning. I've been leaning towards the NDP in this election because not necessarily because I want the Liberals to lose, but because I want to kind of show some of my displeasure towards the Liberals and kind of incentivize them to do better on certain issues like environmental policy and relationships with the First Nations.
Yeah, that's a very valid response. I think this full campaign has been pretty interesting. I know, Ryan, we've heard your thoughts a little bit on this election, but Kris, as a new person to this podcast, what have your thoughts been on the campaign so far? Have you been excited by it? Have you been kind of disappointed? Or what do you think overall?
Yeah, I think like a lot of Canadians and like a lot of friends that I've talked to, people are just kind of don't know who is the best candidate. I've heard a lot of people say, like, I don't know who to vote for. Like, none of them seem very appealing to me. And I kind of fall along that category too. I'm not entirely displeased with the Liberals, and I also don't necessarily think the NDP is the best choice. So I'm really struggling, just kind of like Ryan, to decide between which ones I want to vote for.
Yeah, I think I think that really sums up a lot of like the college educated people I've been talking to, or at least I guess of this education level. Moving onwards, let's hop into a foreign policy, because as we've all noticed, foreign policy hasn't been very prominent this election, and we are three people who hold or are going to hold master's degrees relating to foreign policy and international relations. How does this make us feel? Would we have wanted to see foreign policy play a much larger role?
It's an interesting question, because this is something that I think Canadians kind of have a hard time accepting this just cold hard fact, but Canada doesn't really matter that much on the world stage in terms of foreign policy. We're a middle power, which for those that aren't familiar with the term, it means we have some influence. Certainly, I'm not saying we're irrelevant, and in certain areas we can absolutely throw our weight around a bit, but very often we're tiptoeing around other countries. And it's not surprising to me that foreign policy just really isn't a big focus right now, especially in the midst of a pandemic, oddly enough, even though I think international cooperation is absolutely essential to fighting one. So one would think that maybe foreign policy would be a bigger focus, but these kinds of crisis episodes, I guess you could say, really, like, oftentimes countries are going to look more inward rather than outward. So it's not surprising. I mean, I'd love it to be a bigger deal, Canadians to think a lot more about what our place is in the world, but it is what it is. It's just kind of the nature of the times.
Yeah, I agree with Ryan. I think it's disappointing, but pretty understandable. The pandemic kind of naturally causes societies to look more inwards because the solutions are, mostly coming from within. And in addition to that, we also have to consider, like, as Ryan mentioned, we have to kind of tiptoe around the great powers and how we interact with the world, right? And our main ally and probably source of our kind of legitimacy on the world stage, the United States, is kind of going towards the inward sphere even more so than we are. They've withdrawn from Afghanistan and most of the conflicts, right? I think America is trying to figure out like how to understand themselves on the world stage right now, and that kind of doesn't leave us with a lot of options to go with, right, when it comes to getting their support.
Yeah, and what I quickly want to mention is that what both of you are saying does make sense, and we've heard it from one of the candidates even. I know Trudeau and O'Toole will be more hesitant to say that Canada isn't a big power, but Yves Francois Blanchet straight up said Canada isn't a big power when responding to one of the only foreign policy-related questions in the French language debate. So I think it is a very telling case, but I do think that foreign policy has, in the past, always played a really big role in what it means to be Canadian, as well as, I guess, some of the key elements which defines Canadians. But that doesn't mean that foreign policy has been completely absent. A few highlights, or lowlights, considering the nature of these points, have kind of permeated through a swamp of absence, if I can speak so poetically. Regardless, the first real issue, and this coincided pretty much with the date the election was called, was Afghanistan. As we're all pretty familiar with right now, the Afghanistan nation pretty much fell into the control of the Taliban, and when doing so, most nations started pulling out people. Canada itself has been long involved in the Afghanistan conflict, having served there for, I think, 10, 11 years. During the time we were in Afghanistan, we worked alongside a lot of locals, and we had made promises to them to evacuate them out of Afghanistan. However, that happened very late or not at all. And O'Toole was basically saying, we worked along these side people for years. We kind of knew Afghanistan was falling months in advance. So Trudeau should have done something to get these people out much quicker. Do we think Canada could have done more? Or what do we think about how this has kind of played into the campaign?
Okay, yeah. So, I mean, while it's always easy to say we could have done more in retrospect, I do think it's a very valid criticism right now. I think the fall of Afghanistan, while it happened very suddenly, it's not all that surprising. And I think there should have been more anticipation of that and more resources allocated in order to ensure that these individuals who risked their lives, like their families, to assist the Canadian Army in whatever capacity, to get them out, to make do on the promises given to them. That's something that the West in general, they often fail to do this. They make a lot of promises to people, to locals, because they need the help of the locals. And then when they leave, they don't really do that much to help them. So yeah, I think it's a very legitimate criticism of Trudeau that more should have been done.
I definitely agree that something should have been done. However, if I remember correctly from news reports and things like that, I think the British and American intelligence agencies were not predicting that Afghanistan, the American implanted basically government, would fall this quickly. So I think, obviously those people should have been gotten out a lot sooner. And it is a criticism of Mr. Trudeau, but definitely to his credit, you can say that most of the intelligence people who were advising him probably weren't telling him that he needed to prioritize it as quickly as it should have been, evidently, by the fall of Afghanistan.
Yeah, I definitely concur with what you two are saying, because the fall of Afghanistan, well, it was kind of predicted to happen sometime. It wasn't predicted to happen within a week of America basically pulling out. And that was kind of unanticipated. And consequently, I think it's kind of unfair to say Trudeau could have done more. Maybe he should have done more to get those people there earlier. But like in a hypothetical world, I don't think the conservative leadership would have done more anyways. And I think that's also kind of why this point didn't stick around that much within the context of the election. People basically saw, yeah, we kind of screwed up by not getting our allies and people out quick enough. But the conservatives couldn't really say, oh, we could have done something quicker. They just said we could have done something quicker, but they couldn't make any real promises of anything else going to happen. So it's kind of a really interesting issue of where nobody really wants to do anything with Afghanistan, and we're kind of stuck in this weird situation. So this isn't a really great focal point to put foreign policy around. I mean, not as much as, for instance, like the Syria refugee crisis, where, if you guys remember in 2015, Trudeau could immediately say, I'm taking in 20,000 immigrants, and that made a really distinct impact on the electoral base in Canada. You can't really have that kind of response to Afghanistan. It's not going to factor into the election like that.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And yeah, like on that point, it's one of those things where, yes, the conservatives can rightly criticize, but because they weren't in control at the time, we'll never know what they would have done.
It's a hypothetical.
Exactly. And that's the problem with hypothetical.
And I highly doubt that the conservatives would have questioned the intelligence agencies more than Trudeau would have. Conservatives are very supportive of the military and intelligence apparatus, so I think they would have supported and believed those conclusions even more.
Yeah. I mean, talking about other rising threats and other conclusions, one thing we do know is that China is rising, and China is a pretty big power. And we've collided heads a few times in the past, especially under Justin Trudeau's tenureship. I know we collided over Meng Wanzhou under the Huawei incident, but it hasn't been mentioned much during the campaign, except by Mr. O'Toole, who's made a very big point of trying to hold Trudeau accountable for some of the things that's happened. So, for instance, he's always been campaigning that Canada is one of the only partners in Five Eyes to still be looking at having a 5G network from Huawei, which could be a big security risk. He also mentioned the case of the two Michaels, which we might explain real quickly. And then he also was really prominent on saying that the Liberals weren't quick enough or have not yet condemned the Uyghur genocide. So these are all some pretty virulent points O'Toole has been trying to thrust into the media. What do we think of these points? Do we think that these can become focal points for the election? Or why do we think these haven't really grasped into the Canadian consciousness as much?
To lean back on kind of what I've been saying before, it's just the simple reality that Canada isn't all that powerful on the world stage, and China just so much more is so. That's what a lot of states have to contend with, the fact that they have such a huge economic base, like a huge market, huge manufacturing capacity. It's a thing that you're not just thinking about that kind of stuff. It's easy enough to say, oh, we should be more forceful on China with X, Y, and Z problem. But the reality is they have an economic weight that few countries in the world have, and they are more than willing to use it and to try and gain whatever advantage they can. I mean, the U.S. does this all the time too. It's nothing new. It's what the great powers have always done, is they use the advantages that they have. And you kind of just, as a middle power, you just have to accept some of them. You can certainly push back on others. I mean, I think the Uyghur genocide should be more of a focal point. But again, as terrible as it is to say this, what can Canada do other than these symbolic messages? There's nothing we can really do. We're not going to invade China. So we're kind of just stuck with having to accept certain realities, as horrible as some of those realities are.
But I think one of the points which O'Toole is really keen on making is that some of the realities that we're stuck with might not be the realities we are kind of stuck with. So looking at, for instance, the Uyghur genocide, the House of Commons held a vote sponsored by the Conservatives to condemn the Uyghur genocide. And I believe Trudeau was absent for that vote, as well as I think 20 people from his cabinet. And that was a really big focal point he keeps mentioning. And similarly, it's like the two Michael situation where China illegally detained two Canadian citizens, both coincidentally named Michael, for our arrest of Wang Zaimeng. And we have in no way made any progress in getting them back home. Do you think that these are maybe not realities we have to face? Is there something more we could be doing about this, Kris?
I'm not sure necessarily about the two Michael situation. It's a situation that I'm really scared about myself because when that situation was occurring, my dad was actually working in China. So when I'm not trying to downplay that situation at all, when I say maybe that it's hard for the Canadian government to address that because I was scared that maybe my dad would be taken too, right? But things aren't so easy as, the House of Commons condemns the Uyghur genocide and then China suddenly stops doing it, right? Like Ryan's been saying, we don't have as much power on the world stage to kind of force countries to do this. To people who, live in Canada, maybe their whole lives and they haven't really had much experience with the outside world, like Canada can seem way bigger than it actually is, right? All of Canada's population is like equal to the population of California, right? Just because we have a large territory doesn't necessarily mean we occupy the same amount of power, right? So we have to really work within the confines that are presented by other international actors. So if we don't have the US really willing to confront China in substantial ways, then there's not really much that Canada can do confront China in substantial ways.
No, talking about those international confines, which I think both you and Ryan have been talking about for both of these answers, there has been some movement, at least within some platforms, on expanding those international confines and making our position in the world a little bit stronger. I think notably, the real thing that Ira keeps talking about, the sexy acronym of CANZUK, has been floated around a few times.
Yeah.
Can we explain what CANZUK is really briefly? And do we have any opinions on it?
Yes. I have a lot of opinions on this. This is exactly the type of stuff I'm very interested in. So CANZUK, for those that don't know, it is an acronym combining of three main settler Commonwealth nations plus the UK. So Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom. And there's no like concrete form of it right now. It's never been like officially created by any government. So it doesn't have a true form. So the details can, of course, change. But the basic idea is a quasi-European Union, but those four countries. The argument being they all have very strong cultural, language, and economic ties, especially with history. So the idea is that akin to the EU, we would have free travel between these countries. So an Australian can work in Canada with very little effort. You don't have to get a visa or anything like that. Someone from Wales can go to New Zealand and work. It's kind of a work exchange, if you will, like how the EU works. And there's varying degrees to how integrated framework might be. It wouldn't necessarily be the same as the EU, where there's a European Parliament. Either could or could not exist within CANZUK. It's really up to the four countries. It is odd because it is only four of them. So there would have to be some guarantee that all these nations are entering into this agreement on an equal footing because of the history of British Empire and essentially them deciding all of our foreign policy, our domestic policy in some cases. So there need to be some guarantee of that. Another problem with it is simply geography. All these countries are very far away from each other, aside from New Zealand and Australia. It's these kind of practicalities that for these types of projects, like it sounds cool, some form of political union between these countries, but we're all really far away from each other. You're crossing an ocean, either the Pacific or the Atlantic Ocean, which are huge distances, which really strain these kinds of things. It is like this practical element that kind of just makes it like, is it really worth it? On the other hand, though, this kind of wide, like just geography that CANZUK would hold isn't anything necessarily new. I mean, we were part of the British Empire. That's something that isn't new. It's not a new problem. It's something that's been worked around in the past, back when travel times were much slower. Internet obviously didn't exist. So we do have more tools now that kind of negate these issues of geography in some way. Plus, it also helps in some way strengthen geopolitical considerations for all these countries. If they all acted together, their economy as a whole would be stronger. I mean, Canada and the UK are the top two in this case, but it would increase the relative economic power. So it's an odd thing essentially. There's a lot going for it and a lot going against it, and it's also funny considering that the UK just left a supranatural government, the EU. So clearly they have issues with being in these types of agreements, which for a Canadian, that does not tell me that they would be respectful of the equality of all four of the countries. But it would give us more weight on the world stage. Canada, in that respect, wouldn't be a middle power anymore. You could argue that CANZUK would be a great power, but there is, a severe power imbalance inherent in CANZUK in that the UK is a much bigger economy than the other three. Canada is second, and then Australia, New Zealand.
Yeah, it's a really interesting, I guess, proposal, but it's also one which I have my own reservations against too, because it's simply like, if Can is basically one of the biggest partners in this proposal, that doesn't fill me with a lot of confidence, is how I put it really harshly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure what to make of it. But Kris, really quickly, yes or no? Would you say yes or no to a CANZUK?
That's a hard one because, to be honest, we don't really hear much about CANZUK, and I'm all for greater cooperation between states. I think that it's good to have dialogue and these institutions to facilitate cooperation and networking, right? But I'm just a little skeptical of where CANZUK fits in with all the other things that we have, like the Commonwealth, G20. If it's more of a, so to speak, soft CANZUK, where it's kind of just like a series of agreements, I think it could be fine to have. Doesn't hurt. But if they're trying to go for more like a European Union approach, I'm thinking that the practical realities of the geography, like Ryan said, kind of just get in the way. Free travel to Australia doesn't really do much for Canadians unless the price of an airline ticket goes down drastically, right? And in addition to that, like Ryan also said, the UK's kind of thrown out its credibility when it comes to creating organizations like this because of Brexit, right? They've kind of passed the buck over to the EU to manage its affairs, and it didn't really turn out well for them. So why should we, trust going into this kind of agreement with them, especially considering, they'll be kind of in charge here and we'll have less say. So if they end up not committing to this, it'll hurt us in the end. And lastly, the kind of justification for it based off of our shared heritage, it doesn't really sit well enough with me to completely justify this. Like, we already have the Commonwealth, so I'm not really sure if this is completely necessary.
Yeah, because I especially agree in the latter half, because a lot of the people saying this are more conservative-leaning politicians who claim it's, nations of British origin joining together. But we know Canada isn't anymore a nation of British origin. We're very much a nation of multiculturalism. And I know this might be very progressive of me to say, but I do think that trying to reinforce that background of nationalism or like British nationalism is antithetical to multiculturalism, which you've now kind of accepted as our ideology. So it seems like a weird justification. And moreover, it just seems like it's a cute idea, but I don't see how much it adds to what could have been some other bilateral agreements if we really wanted to make more partnerships happen.
I completely agree. I mean, I'm even in favor of, I don't even like the fact that the monarchy is still part of our system at all. I know it just plays like a figurehead role, but even I don't like the fact that all Canadian power symbolically stems from another country.
Yeah, and if you're a listener, keep in mind that we are, I guess, more liberally minded on the IR scale. Because I know my friend Yusuf, who we've had on for the Conservative Platform review, he loves CANZUK and the idea of CANZUK. I think he just likes cheaper airline tickets or whatever. But regardless, he's very much on board. But yeah,
and me personally, I actually liked the way you said it, Simon. It's a cute idea. Like one part of me thinks it's like, oh, like that's awesome. I love political unions. I mean, I love the EU. I think it's a fantastic concept, at least for them, for Europe. But yeah, it just doesn't really make all that much sense for us. There's just so many things in the way that any benefit.
Literally, there's a whole ocean.
Yeah, there's two oceans.
There's multiple, like, there's so many countries in the way. There's all these, micro states in the Pacific Ocean that are like between us and our supposed, coalition in this case.
Yeah, and exactly. So it's like, whatever benefits we'd get from it, I think just kind of get outweighed by all the limits that it would also give us. And yeah, I don't trust the UK to be a fair partner in that kind of agreement.
Yeah, I guess relating this back more to the election itself, I think the reason it hasn't been mentioned election is because, well, Canadians think, oh, cool, it's another coalition we can join. It's not something we see as a need, right? Because if I asked you, like Ryan or Kris, being more informed, do we need, and really emphasizing that need, to make a union with the UK, Australia, and New Zealand, specifically them? I don't think you guys would be enthusiastically saying yes, yes, yes.
No,
we have NATO. They're in all of those already. So
anything that could be done in this union could just be done through, a bilateral, multilateral agreement that is not as, let's just say, politically motivated. Or, this seems to be kind of trying to create a story of a connection between these countries, right?
Yeah.
And that story, like, is already self-evident enough that we don't need a union to solidify it, right? We all know that we all came from, Britain, so
Exactly.
Once again, it's just a very weird message.
Yeah. Well, I think we've covered CANZUK a lot more than I think most parties have covered CANZUK. So I think we should move on a bit past what has been talked about foreign policy into what can change about foreign policy coming forwards. What I want to structure this section like is I'm going to ask us to give our thoughts on, given how this election turns out, what do we expect can change in certain areas if there was either a change or continuation in leadership? So perhaps, let's say the Conservatives assume power, what could change? Or if the Liberals stay in power, what might stay the same?
Yeah, so I took a look at the party platforms, and it was actually surprising that the Conservatives had probably the most about foreign policy. And there was quite a few things I didn't like, but it was actually not too bad. The thing that concerns me is that what the Conservatives write down in their platform and what they actually do, I don't think they actually believe most of that stuff. And I don't think they'd really push for a lot of it. One of the things I don't like is that they plan to move the embassy to Jerusalem, which I think kind of like needlessly aggravates the Israeli-Palestine conflict. And it's basically the same move that the US did as well. And it's kind of weird. Like, it also says, in the next section that they support a two-state solution, but it's just very strange that they, would be kind of taking this like conciliatory approach while also like doing something that would extremely aggravate the Palestinians, right?
Yeah, I don't want to delve into the minutia of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict.
Oh, yeah.
Because I know I've seen what that did to the Green Party. I don't want that to happen to my podcast.
Oh yeah, for sure.
I will say that I think the Conservatives tend to get more of the Jewish vote, so I could see this being a platform point they put in specific for that purpose. So I view that maybe even less as a foreign policy approach, but more as just a getting the vote approach, right?
Mm-hmm.
For sure.
Yeah. Was there anything that stuck out to you from, let's say, the Liberal platform, Kris? Because you also mentioned you read over that.
Honestly, the Liberal, besides the NDP only had maybe like one page or something about it, but the Liberal platform was very vague. It kind of sounded like they're just going to continue most of what they're already doing. And nothing really, like, I was highlighting things on the Conservative platform that like stuck out to me, but I didn't make a single highlight for the Liberal platform.
I guess on that note, and you were saying that they were just kind of saying they'll continue things as it is. Really quickly from both of you, how well do we think that Liberal foreign policy has been the last few years?
I think there's nothing that stands out, but then again, Canada rarely does stand out foreign policy wise. Like, I hate to keep harping on this, but like, there's just not much we can really do in a lot of cases. And I think honestly, Chrystia Freeland, she was in charge of foreign policy at one point, and she's been heavily involved in that. I think she's done, for like what Canada's standing is, she's done a good job. Like, I'm sure there's been tabloid mistakes, stuff that gets played up, but really doesn't amount to much substantially. like especially the NAFTA renegotiations. I mean, it's the what's the acronym? CUMSA
USMCA.
or USMCA, and then Canada it's CUMSA, and then Mexico has a different one. And I mean, it's essentially just NAFTA 2.0. And really, from that perspective, Canada did a good job of just, keeping things kind of the way they are.
What do you think, Kris? How do you think the Liberals have done, really quickly?
To be honest, there's not really much that has stood out to me over the past few years when it comes to Liberal foreign policy. I mean, there is obviously like the weight of the pandemic and kind of the more shift inwards, both, from the public and, myself, right? We all are kind of thinking more about Canada. I don't know what I think, to be honest, guys.
No, but it's a valid point, because when I think back to what I was going to say, answer this question, if I was given this first by myself, I would have pointed to maybe the 2018 dispute we had with Saudi Arabia. I would have said maybe some other stuff about like Trudeau's trips to India and China in, I think, 2017 and 2018, which didn't go too well. But that was all before the last election, right? Since 2019, we've been very quiet on the international front, partly because Trudeau hasn't been allowed to leave the country due to a global pandemic.
Yeah.
He hasn't been allowed to make more faux pas, And
then we did well during that little tariff spat. We showed the U.S. that you can't just completely disregard us. So I think that was a good showing of Canadian foreign policy. The retaliatory tariffs we did, like it hurt the U.S. more than they hurt us. So
yeah, and I mean, as always, I think just the brand of Liberal foreign policy under Trudeau has continued. So that values-driven approach, driven by, I guess, like women's rights as well, and really making that prominent, that has been very prominent as well from what I've seen. So I guess, yeah. But then on the other hand, the bigger issue I have, in summary, with the Liberal foreign policy is that it's very often saying a lot and saying a lot and saying a lot of one type of rhetoric, but on the other hand, they still have these weird, shady deals, which nobody talks about. So, like, for instance, they might say they're all for, like, equality, protecting innocence, that kind of stuff, but then we're still the second largest weapon supplier to the Middle East. Or something like that. It's like...
I wanted to touch on that, but I didn't know if it was old news.
It's old news, but it's still going on, right? And as you two are Canadians, you guys should feel ashamed, which I can say from a moral high ground, right?
Yeah, oh sure, because the Dutch have never done anything.
But going Ryan just trailing out. But no, going on to this election, do we think anything would change if the Liberals retain power?
No,
I can say that with confidence, especially reading this platform. If their platform is like, if your platform is like 100%, we don't expect every party to do everything, right? So usually, you'll have like, maybe if you say like 70% is what they actually do, like this is not even 70% on the platform, right? Like just sounds very vague, like you were saying. So I would not have much faith in the Liberals doing anything different than they are. I wouldn't think they would degrade our international standing, but I wouldn't expect them to make significant leaps and bounds.
So that was my point when you both were so quick to say no. No might not be a bad answer, considering how well typically Canada performs on the international stage, especially in like the liberal institutional kind of frame where we excel.
Exactly. Like we have we're perceived pretty well on the world stage, and I don't think that's necessarily going to really change regardless of who's in power. So like even if the Conservatives take over with either a minority or a majority, I don't think substantially much is going to really change. I don't think there's going to be much difference.
Do you share that as well, Kris? Because that was the second part of this question I was going to. Let's say that O'Toole manages to pull off a victory. Do you think Canadian foreign policy will also change a little?
So I would expect it to change a little bit, but I wouldn't expect... So a lot of their foreign policy is about standing up to China. And like we said before, that's not as easy. I would expect them to make some sort of gestures towards the Uyghur genocide. I would expect them to, try a little bit more towards getting the two Michaels back. But I wouldn't expect any, substantial changes, right? Like they're not going to start a whole trade war with China, right? Like that's something that needs some larger players, or at least a collection of smaller players, in order to, have significant takeoff, so to speak, with that kind of initiative, right?
So, in essence, what I'm getting is that foreign policy isn't really relevant whatsoever to this election.
Yeah, pretty much.
It should be, though. It really should be, because people always say, like, why do I care about other places in the world, right? What happens over there doesn't matter to me. But then 20 years later, China's the number 2 superpower in the world, and they're saying, why didn't we do anything, right? So I think, people often downplay foreign policy, especially since we're here on our, like, North American island. We're kind of isolated from the rest of the world. We just got the relatively friendly to us United States beneath us. And then way down there's South America. We don't ever think about it, right? And then we have oceans on all sides. So I think, like, there's not a lot of incentive, compared to, like, a European, for Canadians to think about foreign policy. We can just say, like, let those people do what they want. Yeah, but if you actually want what you want to happen overseas to happen, then you need to be involved, no matter how isolated you are, right? And people only start to realize that in hindsight, and then blame, other leaders and things like that, right?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Do you also have thoughts kind of on maybe why foreign policy isn't as prominent as election, Ryan?
Just kind of rehashing the same points. It's just we're in a pandemic, so naturally people are going to be looking for inward solutions more so, and yeah, like, Canada just is isolated geographically from the rest of the world. We have the 2 huge oceans and then the big economy below us, and that's really all we have to worry about 90% of the time. And that being said, I do wish, like, agreeing with Kris, that it's on people's mind more. And one area that I wish was more focused on, which only one of the parties is only briefly mentioned, the Conservatives, talking about the Arctic and the opening of the Northwest Passage, which, without getting into it too much, is going to be the next kind of big area of geopolitical significance. And being a country with the second largest Arctic presence in the world after Russia, it's something Canada is going to have to start thinking more and more about. For those that aren't too familiar, the Northwest Passage is essentially a trade route that doesn't yet exist up in the Arctic archipelago of Canada, where right now it's covered in ice, but due to the gradual warming of the planet that we've been going through now for the last century, it's starting to melt up there, all the ice, and it's opening up what is referred to as the Northwest Passage. And basically why it's significant is it considerably reduces shipping costs from Asia to Europe. It's basically cuts costs by a third. So it's a potentially very significant route of international trade, which along with that comes a potentially lucrative revenue stream.
We basically have a frozen Panama Canal behind us.
But the advantage it has over the Panama Canal is that it's not artificial, which means that boats can be much bigger than boats that go through the Panama Canal because they're restricted by the actual dimensions of the canal itself. Whereas the Northwest Passage, it's just sea with a bunch of islands, which just means more cargo, which just means more money, essentially.
I was going to ask in a second what you guys thought would have been things to focus on too, but I'm glad you brought it up, Ryan, now, because it's a good transition. But my personal theory on why we're not focusing on it is because whatever commitments we make towards it, any of the main parties make towards it, it's not commitments we'll ever be able to uphold. Because if we look at, upholding these Arctic claims, it requires policing the Arctic. And what does that require? A Navy and Army which is capable of doing that, which right now the Canadian Navy is nowhere near capable of policing the Arctic. We can't even police the Great Lakes. So why could we even police the Arctic, right? So that requires a mass amount of investment. And we've seen O'Toole spend a lot on this platform, but not much of it is going to replacing those old icebreakers or getting new ones.
Yeah, no, that's it's a big thing, is like it's just kind of getting ignored because it will require a lot of development, which I do think Canada is uniquely positioned to take advantage of it if it wants to. But that is the biggest problem, is any party actually trying to do this, because it will be a lot of money, and it's always a tough sell spending that much money on something so far away.
Yeah. Honestly, my opinion on it is I think if something will happen, it'll happen in a coalition with America, because they'll be able to fund it and we'll be able to kind of like sit on the sidelines, not do too much, but still get some of the benefits.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a real shame that that's the case, right? I mean, hopefully Canada gets a good deal in that scenario, but it's really important, as you guys have said, that Canada should be focusing on this early, because, when you're building an institution, it's the people who build an institution, for example, maybe if there's like an agreement for negotiating this Arctic, kind of getting in early and securing your place allows you to kind of build the structures that organize that, whether it be like a multilateral institution or just like an agreement. Like being kind of first in there can help secure your interests. So it definitely would be good for Canada to like start forming plans on what they would want to do in this scenario. I haven't really seen it talked too much about, and the public doesn't really seem too aware of it from what I've seen. So
Yeah,
definitely good points from.
I guess you guys were talking earlier on why perhaps foreign policy wasn't as big of a deal. And my personal pet theory is that foreign policy is becoming antiquated, especially due to the rise of globalization, where issues that used to be foreign policy are now incorporated into other aspects of the campaign. So for instance, look at like climate change and global warming. That used to not really be on the agenda, and used to, a lot of times with the international agreements like the Paris Accords, that's technically foreign policy, right? How that's negotiated amongst other states. And it's been relegated instead of the category of foreign policy, but to the category of climate change. Similarly, with the pandemic, we see a lot of the talk of the pandemic coming of cooperation with others, and that itself requires diplomacy and foreign policy as well. So do we kind of think that perhaps foreign policy has shifted as a concept to be more wider and general in discourse? Or am I just making an insane observation?
I don't know. That's a very, like, I don't know if necessarily philosophical reimagining of foreign policy. That's a big question. I don't think there's an easy answer to that. I think foreign policy certainly has evolved considerably. We've seen a lot of changes, and then more so since the end of the Cold War. We're kind of in this strange era where there's not a really like defining focus of geopolitics anymore. Or if there is, it's a lot harder to really pinpoint what it is. China, yes, but like it's not on that same level of the Cold War, when you have two nuclear powers at any moment ready to blow the other one to hell. Like it's just not that existential aspect to it.
In the 60s, like we had several elections which are almost completely decided about the question of whether or not Canada should accept nukes from America. And that kind of rhetoric has been present within our lifetimes during elections. So it's kind of interesting, right?
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, we're kind of just we're in this weird spot of foreign policy.
But I guess that means it's good too, right? Because that means there's no big crisis really coming. I feel like foreign policy only props into the mainstream attention when something goes wrong, right?
True.
We never have like an entire segment debate, like in a debate dedicated towards, relations with China have been great for 20 years. What do we think about it? Like, that's not something we argue about, right?
Yeah. And then actually now I have thought of one thing that I think right now it's kind of focused on, but so loosely, is like, as you're saying before, climate change. I think that in the coming decades will be the defining aspect of foreign policy, because it's something that needs to be tackled on a global level. It's impossible to do it. Like any one nation doing it by itself just won't work. We're going to need to cooperate, which the current trends show that it's not good.
Yeah. I would definitely agree with you, Ryan, on that. If we don't cooperate, the major issue in foreign policy is how to get resources from everybody else while the world burns.
Which is pretty bleak.
Yeah, I guess I would characterize like this general, I guess, malaise that you're speaking of, Ryan, as kind of like the West right now, not even just Canada itself. Like I kind of mentioned this before with the U.S. withdrawing from Afghanistan, doesn't really know like what we are supposed to do on the international stage anymore. The war on terror, it's kind of over. I mean, it's still going on, but it's more just like protection rather than more like domestic intervention, right? Rather than projection. And then, the war on drugs, like everybody hates it. And then we've also seen like a number of kind of like embarrassing, failures in response to international things like Brexit, Trump's handling of the pandemic, things like that, right? So like the West is kind of like, I think, on shaky ground. We're not really sure like how we should be handling things. I don't know if we're confident or have the will to like be doing these massive changes in the international scene, right? Like, can you imagine like something like the peacekeepers being invented right now, like in the United Nations being proposed? I can't. Like, I feel like every politician is a little bit scared of trying anything super new and super risky, which is really scary considering, like we said before, climate change is going to be an issue that needs to be addressed, right?
Yeah. And I think it really is there's no big scary enemy anymore. Like for the Cold War, it was, East versus West. They could both view each other as existential threats. And that, really focuses your foreign policy because you have an obvious enemy, something obvious to fight against. Where with climate change, not to get too, philosophical, but the enemy is ourselves. Like,
damn, dude.
We're the ones causing it. Like every country is in some part causing it. And how do you fight that? Like it's, there's no human element. It's so easy to see an enemy in another human being, but like the environment, like is the enemy. Like, it's hard to conceptualize.
Or your car, right? Like,
yeah.
Right?
Do you think that maybe, I guess, the focus of O'Toole on China within his platform is him trying to refocus China as the enemy and establish some kind of focal point to his struggles or his campaigning?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I think he's trying to like create a common enemy that people can rally around, right?
Do we think we need a common enemy in Canada?
No.
Not necessarily. I think China can be... I think like the rise of China is definitely something that we need to address, but it doesn't necessarily need to be... it does need to be confrontational to some extent, but it's not, like Ryan said, the Cold War, where we're like on the verge of annihilating each other. There's like the Cuban Missile Crisis happening, right? It's not like at that level, right? I think it's something that needs to be addressed more with, decoupling our like economic dependence on China, right? And actually, to their credit, like there was a little bit of that mentioned in the conservative platform, but like I said before, I really don't think that most, like conservatives, the person you're going to elect for your riding, believe most of the stuff that sounds like more liberal and centrist in their platform, or at least they're not going to like push for it, right? I think it's going to be more of like the standard, right? Rather than this more like centrist leading conservative party.
Well, I think it's becoming nigh time to kind of wrap it all together, right? Do you want to give any final thoughts really quickly, maybe a minute each, on how do we think foreign policy has played into this election and how do you think it should have played into this election?
So I think it really has, other than sound bites and just something to, kind of attack during debates, it really hasn't been much of a focal point, and I'm not at all surprised by that. And I do think that all the parties, regardless if they get voted into power or not, I think Canada really does need to start thinking about this coming Arctic problem. It is going to be one of the next big spheres of geopolitics. I firmly believe that, and I think it's something that we need to start considering more seriously.
What about you, Kris? What are your final thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with Ryan on most of the things he said about, it not being surprising that during this pandemic that we're kind of focusing more on domestic recovery and just, domestic issues coming to the fore in general, right? I do think that one of the things that should be talked about is Canadian, partnerships abroad. I don't want to see those partnerships, falling. I want like more commitment with the developing countries, because I mean, if you want to fight China, so to speak, then you need to like make sure that it doesn't give too much aid to developing countries and then have them become their allies, and on top of obviously the human realities that like giving aid helps people, right? So I definitely think that I don't want to see what should have been focused is like expanding or at least maintaining Canada's position among the world and our aid to developing countries.
Yeah, those are some good thoughts from you too. It's been a very interesting episode to record because admittedly foreign policy has been something of a non-issue throughout this election, but it's interesting to see why it's a bit of a non-issue, right? And I think that's very indicative of how the state of the world is and is informative beyond just the scope of there being an election going on right now. So to wrap it all together, I always finish with a personal question where I ask a question unrelated to the topic we've had at hand, but still semi-related at the same time. In a hypothetical world, the winner of this election, or the candidate who wins this election, has made a nice promise where he says, because I won, I'm going to be nice. I'm going to add one piece of territory to Canada. What piece of land or territory should we add to Canada? And in this scenario, we're literally like helicopter lifting it and attaching it to the country.
Well, so we're just stealing a piece of land.
Yeah, it could be a country, it could be a specific city you really like, just some kind of foreign thing that you're adding.
Do we get to transport the climate as well? Because bringing some places to Canada would just make them snowy.
It'll be like a self-contained bubble you're taking, like a little dome.
Ah, okay. So who wants to hang out with this?
Yeah, what addition does Canada need, right? What are we lacking?
Well, I mean, we could do CANZUK, but we could always just bring Australia to Canada,
Yeah.
right? So we could just bring all the nice parts of South Australia to Canada, so that we don't have to travel and create this complicated agreement, right? So that would be my choice.
Mm-hmm.
The nice parts of Australia.
That's a good idea. Save us from the CANZUK debate by just having it in our country.
Yeah, like I would. New Zealand would be nice too. A nice island that's not...
Just collect all the CANZUK countries.
Yeah, but not UK. We'll leave the UK.
Why would we want the UK? It just rains.
Exactly. Oh, yeah. Oh, New Zealand.
Ah, what a tame answer. New Zealand was actually going to be my answer.
Oh.
So now I have to think of a new one.
Because then now we'll have the Lord of the Rings. Like the...
But now we actually have a reason to create open borders agreements, because they're actually near us.
Yeah.
Where would you put them in Canada? I guess extend this.
Well, it'd have to be offshore.
Like little islands? I in my ideal world, would start filling into Hudson Bay.
Oh.
I'm gonna say out east, not because I'm kind of from out east, but just because Vancouver's already nice. We need something to get people going east. There's not much going for it already. So
yeah,
let's put Australia there. They can go see the Bay of Fundy, and then they can go do some surfing on the beach in Australia.
Go to the Great Barrier Reef.
Yeah. The Great Barrier Bay of Fundy.
Great Bundy.
Oh, that'd be such a tourist attraction. Like combining the Great Barrier Reef and the Bay of Fundy. The Barrier of Fundy.
The water just, how the Bay of Fundy, the water like goes back so much, right? So the water goes back, and then you can just walk on the Great Barrier Reef. All the animals are like dying and stuff, but the coral would probably be pretty cool.
Well, that's a nice little.
Yeah, they're already dying.
Yeah, the coral. Yeah, you're right, Ryan. What's the point?
Yeah.
I was thinking maybe some nice, I guess more like I was thinking maybe like a nice sunny vacation destination as well, like some Spanish beaches or like some French Riviera or something like that.
Yeah,
you could have a nice little add some culture, put it in Quebec somewhere.
Just take the Canary Islands and drop them in Lake Ontario.
Or Singapore. Just have this badass looking island that just looks cool.
Singapore is just a badass looking island that looks cool.
Yeah.
That's a great description. We're gonna put that on the travel brochure.
Yeah. Well, I think that kind of wraps it all together then for today. I'm glad we finished talking about badass islands, because that's what this podcast is all about. But thanks for coming on, Ryan and Kris. I've had a great time talking to you too.
And thank you very much, Simon.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, no worries. I'm sure you can find Kris and Ryan around. They're making waves in Carleton and in Waterloo, so you'll find them.
Of course.
Big splashes.
As to this podcast, our next episode should be analyzing some of the Conservative campaign and having some reflections on that before we head to the polls. So that should be fun. That should be out tomorrow. And then on this weekend, I should be doing another episode where we're giving a final kind of like report card grade or look at each of the political parties and kind of rating their campaigns. And that should be out on Monday or about Sunday night, Monday morning, the day before the election comes. And then we have a host of other election content planned for you for on election day itself. So yeah, it should be a fun time. If you enjoyed, please leave a like, please subscribe. This podcast, I recently managed to figure out how to put it on Apple Podcasts, so I think you can leave a review too if you're listening on that. So thanks for listening there. But yeah, anyways, thanks for listening too. You aren't listening on there, so yeah, talk to you guys later then. Bye.
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 Okay, I'll
Bye.
do a
Please
better
vote.
one.
I forgot my other piece of paper.
This will all be in the final cut, by the way.
Yeah, I'll put it in the end, you know.
All right, perfect. Nothing could go wrong.
No.
I have a lot of notes, sorry, from previous things. I took
A
notes
lot of
during all the
paper
debates.
wrestling.
Shut up.
Please mute your mic, Simon. Very distracting.
This is, are you taking over? Where did the piece of paper go? I want it.
Point of parliamentary
Inquiry?
whatever. Yeah.
Simon is distracting me right now.
Parliamentary procedure. Screw it, I'll just do it off my head and screw it up. Regardless. Okay, we'll start.